welcome you to the second webinar in our series of grants planning and management. Today we have three presenters who are going to help us think more deeply about how to plan and execute successful funding strategies to support our various types of projects. Their presentations will be followed by, let me just flip over here to the agenda. Their presentations are going to be followed by a time for questions and discussion, but I encourage you to post your questions as you think of them into the chat box or the Q&A window, so we'll capture those, and we can, the speakers can choose to refer to them during their presentations, or we can hold them until the Q&A part of the agenda. And as we usually do, we'll end the webinar with news and upcoming programs. Today's webinar will be followed by a Learning Lab conference call next Thursday at 3 p.m. Eastern, when you'll be able to ask Michael Comeau more in-depth questions about today's topic. And Barbara Teague will tell you more about that a little bit later today. So let me introduce you to today's presenters. Michael Comeau is the Executive Director of the Massachusetts Archives and Commonwealth Museum, where he oversees the preservation and management of the Commonwealth's permanent public records. As Director, he has worked to develop and implement programs and strategies to advance the archives and museum in their mission to document and preserve the history of the Commonwealth and to expand capabilities to meet the challenges of emerging technologies. During his tenure, Michael has worked on a wide variety of grant initiatives from an equally diverse array of funding sources, both public and private. Grant projects have ranged from smaller-scale efforts with focused deliverables to more expansive ventures with broader national appeal and impact. Our second speaker is Jodie Foley, the current Montana State Archivist, a position that she has served in since 2005. She's worked at the Montana Historical Society since 1990, working as an archives technician, an archivist, and oral historian prior to taking the position of state archivist. A native of Missoula, Montana, she did her undergraduate and graduate work in Western history at the University of Montana. Jodie served on the CoSA board from 2007 to 2010, and most recently on CoSA's CERI Best Practices and Standards Committee from 2012 to 2016. And our final speaker for today is Errol Somay, who's Director of the Virginia Newspaper Project at the Library of Virginia in Richmond. Errol has written or assisted in the preparation of grants to the National Endowment for the Humanities for more than 20 years. And prior to coming to Virginia, Errol held library-related positions at the New York Public Library and Columbia Libraries. We welcome all three of you to today's program, and now I'll turn the microphone over to Michael Comeau. Michael?
Hello. I think I have control here. Yes, I'm from the Massachusetts Archives, and welcome everybody. In today's webinar, my colleagues and I hope to share some of our experiences with grant planning and management and hopefully provide you all with some sort of insight that might benefit you and your institutions in this regard. For my part, I thought I would focus on what has, for my institution at least, become an increasingly popular approach to grants and grant management, and that is aligning ourselves as a partner in collaborative grant proposals that target specific needs and objectives we seek to address. So rather than looking specifically at a singular effort with a step-by-step analysis and attendant lessons learned, I think my main point today is going to be to share a general philosophical approach that we have to identifying and pursuing grant-funded opportunities. Now, I'm sure we're all familiar with the tried and true method of grant management, but I think I might term best today as going it alone. You'll hear a lot more later from my colleagues, I'm sure, about their experience with the grant initiatives and how they've managed in more specific substantive detail to deal with them. But as a general outline, I think there are some uniform elements. Obviously, you need to identify a critical need. And of course, along this path, you have to honestly assess your own internal resources, capabilities, and means of mapping achievable, measurable deliverables. You identify a potential funding source. Basically, you have to know where the money is. You'll need to craft a qualified application, one that establishes both your capabilities and your credibility. It appeals to the funding authority and sets measurable objectives. It also needs to be sustainable. So naturally, at the Massachusetts Archives, we don't have an internal grant writing staff, so To farm this important task out, we need to add it to the additional tasks that we already have on our plate. If successful, of course, you have to manage the resources once they are secured. Now, of course, this is a lot of work, but if you're the captain of your own ship, you're going to have control from concept to completion. Next. Here at the Mass Archives, we have, over the years, had the opportunity to work on a wide array of grant projects. And I've listed a few of the larger ones here on the screen in front of us. They range from some bigger ticket projects, generally in the neighborhood of, say, $200,000 to $400,000. We've also managed more narrowly targeted focused efforts, and those include gifts from various sources for, say, conservation or digitization on select items or collections. For the construction of our museum a few years back, we actually received a fair number of grants from private, corporate, and charitable foundations as well, with very specific guidelines and requirements to follow. I think regardless of the expanse and complexity of the project, however, the real key here is that the basic steps remain the same. Now, there are distinct advantages to going on the solo approach. Most importantly, you have control. So you know best what you want, you know best what you want to achieve, so you write the grant and set the priorities accordingly. For this all-important final result, however, assuming all goes according to plan, in our instance, that rarely is the case. It's what you want to be. You want the grant is what you want it to be. The workflow then proceeds in a sequence and schedule of your choosing. Of course, on the other side, you have complete control. And that means that all of those pesky administrative responsibilities attendant to grant management, including but not limited to financial control and oversight. You have to manage your overhead and operating expenses. That's salaries, that's equipment, programmatic operating expenses, IT expenses. In Massachusetts, for federal grants, we pay about 10% off the top, sometimes a little bit more depending on the circumstances, to the state comptroller's office in indirect costs. Now, this is actually a bit more of a streamlined process than it once was in the past when we were required to coordinate with separate House and Senate committees on federal financial assistance. Of course, whatever percentage is dedicated to those costs, it's money that you're not using for your primary objectives. So because of this, we have in the past had to spend a fair amount of energy on negotiations with state authorities in an effort to waive as much of the tribute as we could so we could maximize the benefit of the gift. Now, with the solo approach, you have to create and manage budgets, the necessary documentation and compliance issues, as well as revenue and expenditure reconciliation in your state's accounting system, which can be detailed. For us, we employ a system called the Massachusetts Management Accounting Reporting System, or MARS. And for federal grant records conciliation, this comes with a lovely 70-plus page reporting guide that's about as easy to navigate as a set of poorly constructed stereo instructions. So I'm going to offer you a different approach now. There's actually hope. And I'm going to call this approach the collaborative approach. This is one that we've increasingly chosen as a path here at the Massachusetts Archives. It's pretty self-explanatory, but in our particular instance, we've used it as a method to relieve ourselves of much of the burden that comes often with being the primary fiscal agent. Basically, we've aligned ourselves with suitable partners in a fashion that allows us to leverage our major assets, our people, our skills, our collections, while sidestepping much of the administrative responsibilities attendant with a normal process. I'm hoping that sidestepping isn't too strong a term in this case. I mean, I don't want this to sound like some late-night infomercial where they tell you you can lose weight or, make a lot of money in real estate without actually doing anything. It's just that for us, fiscal responsibility can prove to be somewhat of an impediment. Of course, if you want to take the mantle of fiscal agent, you can do that. But in our case, we choose to employ the same fiscal budget, but we have to actually, we're compelled to employ the same fiscal and budget management people that service all of the divisions of the Secretary's office. So removing this requirement from our plate has really expanded the number of opportunities that we can realistically consider. There are, of course, immediately obvious benefits to playing the role of a partner. First and foremost, grant lovers are going to love it. Clearly, collaboration is a value add in the eyes of many reviewers, and it's something that they often look for in applications. Many grant programs, in fact, make collaboration a requirement for funding. At the very least, it's going to give your application added weight. Now, you don't necessarily have to remove yourself from the burden. I mean, serving as a meaningful partner, of course, entails serious commitment and effort on your part. But as part of a collaborative, you're part of a team, and across-the-board responsibilities can be spread out and shared. By sharing the effort, the entire process from application to execution can become a more manageable issue. And if you're like us, consistently trying to move forward under the reality of finite and often limited resources, this is no small thing. By combining administrative functions and expenses, you likewise realize economies of scale. So partnering with others also allows you the opportunity to play to your own strengths and delegate to others those activities where you might be less effective. As part of the collaborative effort, you can also enhance the visibility of your final product, and working with others assists in sustaining your efforts beyond the grant period itself. the message here is collaboration can really extend the reach of all of the participants. So, all of these collaborative opportunities, I'm going to divide them basically into two categories. One is which you leverage your expertise, the other one which you leverage your collections. Now, in the first category, you are contributing the time and talents of you and your staff to a collective purpose. This particular approach has proven really effective for us for a variety of reasons. We're far more able to commit our time and talent to specific projects. If we don't, like I mentioned earlier, have to engage our office's financial support infrastructure. I've listed a lengthy list here of some of the grants we serve in a particular leveraging capacity for expertise. These are all efforts that allow us to address critical challenges. You'll notice some emphasis in the list on emergency preparedness and disaster recovery. And just as important, it allows us to connect with some core constituencies. As you can see, there's a variety of funding resources that we dealt with. And I'm going to make particular note of one right in the middle, the Massachusetts Municipal Clerks Archival Records Project, which last year we received the CoSA Rising Star Award for. So we're pretty proud of that. The second category is going to relate to those efforts where we specifically leverage our collections as the primary point of attraction. Now, in these instances, we've been able to align ourselves with partners with vast experience, influence, and cachet among funding sources, which, as you can see here, would be Harvard and Yale universities. In both instances, elements of our legislative materials, namely our legislative petitions, were identified as significant underutilized records that provided new and expansive avenues for analysis to important historical issues and events. Now, these particular grant initiatives have in some ways crafted a kind of a new pattern for us. In each instance, the program being wholly dependent on our records, we've managed to secure a wide degree of control in managing the workflow. Digitization of records included in part of the project's deliverables provided us with an end product that we would never have been able to afford on our own. And most, if not all, of the administrative responsibilities of these efforts fall beyond our purview. What's more, Harvard has been very, very interested in expanding our current scope and is continually trolling for new funding sources to carry on the work. Pretty much the only thing we've had to do is write the occasional letter of recommendation as they sort of identify new funding sources and just speak in favor of it. Another favorable byproduct here was our ability to tap into the extensive marketing and public relations capability that these universities have, which are extensive, so partnering both Harvard and Yale really brought attention to our holdings, something we're always trying to do, to a much wider and more diverse audience. So I would just recommend, as a sort of a parting shot here, giving the collaborative approach serious consideration. We can recommend it. We've had good experience with it, and as I said, it's opened up a wide variety of opportunities we might otherwise not have been able to look at. So I will say as a concluding point that having built a reputation here at the State Archives as an often willing or at least willing partner, or at least an institution willing to listen to proposals, we do get approached fairly often and regularly with ideas. So again, we're waiting for the next big one coming along. We're excited about it, and I highly recommend you give this a shot. And with that, I'm going to pass the controls over to my colleague, Jodie Foley from Montana.
Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for this opportunity to speak to you about grant planning and writing. This image that you see on the screen right now is one of my absolute favorites, and for some odd reason reminds me of grant writing, specifically receiving that grant rejection letter, or sometimes even an offer letter if the grant was more than you. I was just that moment of, oh, now we get to do it. Ooh. But that is one of the first lessons of grant writing. Learn from your mistakes and get back on the horse. When I was asked to participate in this webinar, I must admit to some trepidation. I'm not a professional grant writer. I have not written or administered any groundbreaking grants. But as part of the Montana Historical Society Research Center, I have worked on grants that were critical to us. So I think my role here is really to share what worked for us and hope it will be helpful for you as you peruse and pursue grant funding. I also hope my comments will encourage participants to share their experiences and to further enrich the webinar. So my discussion points will be on approaches to grant writing that I believe helped us fulfill the goals of an NHPRC minimal processing grant that we were awarded and successfully completed between 2011 and 2013, specifically looking at two overall approaches. One, integrating grant planning into your overall strategic planning, and doing a group approach to grant writing. Then I'll close with a few tried and true suggestions or tips that most of us have probably heard, but they bear repeating. But of course, a little background. Montana Historical Society is a state-funded entity that includes the archives, whose collecting focus is split between government records and private collections. The State Records Management Program is not part of our purview. That function is part of the Secretary of State. We have a 5-person staff in the archives, the state archivist, government, senior manuscript archivist, and oral historian accessioning archivist, as well as an electronic records archivist. The archives resides within a larger program, the Research Center, which includes the Archives, Library, and Photograph Archive subprograms. We share reference duties and do a lot of cross-training, so we are used to a collaborative workforce and approach to work. So that's why these approaches work for us. We do not have a grant writer on staff, but we do have a director who is active in grant writing and planning and whose goal has been to centralize grant writing activities. Pre-planning. Successful grant writers would tell you that the most important part of the process of grant planning is being prepared, and good pre-planning is essential to that. Getting as much information gathered about your wants, needs, capabilities, and goals together prior to looking for a grant source allows you to be much more nimble when appropriate grant funds come along and deadlines are short. A simple template is one way to do this, containing information that is required on most grants. As you can see on the screen here, your introductory statement, mission statement, history of your institution, collection highlights, past grants received, all those kinds of things really can be put into a document beforehand that make you able to really jump on opportunities when they come along. And putting this into a shared environment like SharePoint where people can add material as you're able to create it is also very helpful. With the Historical Society, we ended up using a grant writing team approach, but specifically looking at this within the context of strategic planning. Beginning in 2009, the Research Center began a strategic planning series of sessions that included reworking many of our processes, procedures, and workflows, including grant writing. Up to this point, grant writing had been rather ad hoc. A staff member, team member, or manager would find a promising grant, ask permission to pursue it, write the grant, and ask assistance where they needed it. This often led to grant projects that were not always fully understood by staff at large and whose demands left the impacted staff feeling overextended. With the director's guidance, the Research Center developed a more organized and formal approach to pursuing grants. In this vein, then, the sub-program managers and staff were tasked with determining 5-year goals and brainstorming how grants might facilitate those goals. So, for our strategic planning in the archive sub-program, we determined that our most pressing need, with the farthest reaching impact across the program, was our ever-expanding backlog. I'm sure that sounds familiar. In our discussions, we looked at the following questions. Why did we have such a backlog? What was the impact of the backlog on our overall program? How can we address it? And what can we do to prevent and slow its growth in the future? We, of course, found that our backlog mirrored that of most similar institutions. And as effectively stated in Green and Meisner's work, it was a professional thing, stemming from rigid views of processing. But there were effective ways to not only address backlogs, but also keep them at bay in the future, specifically MPLP. We had begun applying these techniques, but we wanted to do something more systematic through establishing workflows. So with all this in mind, we decided that we needed a grant that would allow us to reduce our backlog, specifically looking at government records because that was the biggest and fastest growing backlog. And secondly, to revamp our policies and procedures to integrate MPLP, develop processing guidance documents for staff, give us a kickstart in processing, allowing us to get a substantial body of work done that we could then continue our analysis to improve that policy and procedure writing, and frankly to hire people as the current staff already felt pretty stretched and could not devote that kind of exhaustive time. We made our pitch to the team leads and the director, and they agreed that the backlog of government records collections was a huge challenge for reference staff, which all 3 of our subgroups do. subprograms do, I should say, and that it should be the #1 grant writing priority for the coming grant cycles. The archive staff and director were then tasked with researching potential grants that could meet these needs. We reviewed various websites, NEH, NHPRC, CLEAR, looking at what had been funded, what the expectation of the grants were, and if our proposed project would meet those expectations. We also considered what our existing relationships were with these funders and how they might be helpful. In the end, we found that NHPRC's minimal processing grant fit us best, as it emphasized minimal processing and access to hidden records. Past awardees had been given funds for staff. We believed that we had significant government records to work with to fit the broad-ranging interest or national interest of NHPRC, and we had a great working relationship with them. We had worked on a traveling archivist grant with them, of course, SHRAB grants over the years, and an electronic records planning grant. From the beginning, we decided that not only would the grant planning be a group activity, but so would the writing. Now, I know most of you are thinking, grant writing by committee, are you deranged? But we really didn't see it that way. For us, it was parsing out our tasks to fit staff interests and talents and allowing them to gain a sense of ownership and hopefully avoid some of the pitfalls that result from going it alone. Planning meetings were held to refine the project and assign appropriate segments of the grant. The director was given overall oversight, setting of guidelines, creating an outline of the grant based on NHPRC guidelines and posting them to a shared site, and the final editing to unify the voice of the grant. Archive staff was to select collections, write the historical relevance statements, and define the needed changes in policies, procedures, and workflows. And our HR staff was looking at the budgets, ensuring understanding of financial requirements, and ensuring that all financial submission materials, i.e. the DUNS numbers, tax IDs, the dreaded indirect cost rules, were understood. And I'm not going to say that this process was easy. Grant writing is hard work. And specifically, there are a few challenges to this approach. As you can imagine, controlling the herd. The only way to really do this is just be very well organized and make sure that you have regular meetings and hard deadlines that people know that they need to meet. We found that a shared site was a really good way to do that. Of course, we started to use Asana later, which is a project planning software, which is a really good product if you're not familiar with it. And the challenges for writing is trying to keep your voice uniform. And what I mean by that is you've got, in this case, 5 or 6 different people writing different portions, and everybody writes a little bit differently. But you want to present through the grant itself a unified voice so that it sounds like your organization, not all these disparate voices. And the only really way to do that is have one person edit at the end and bring that united voice together. Also ensuring that sections are complete and standalone. Reviewers do not always see all the sections, so each one of them does need to be complete, and someone needs to be checking on that to make sure all the pieces fit. Another challenge is avoiding insider terms or insider writing. The best way to do this is really have someone outside of your program read through the grant and make sure that there aren't pieces that are assumed. Again, your reviewers may not specifically be from your area of expertise, so be as specific as you can. Mostly success requires strong guidance, which we had from our director, and buy-in from staff, which we also had. The advantages of this approach, I think, are, I really like this photo too. I'm not sure exactly what that guy's doing, but he's definitely in an awkward place. So not hanging out on your own. You have this sense of working as a group, and people have a sense of the goals and the buy-in. Your participants have a broader understanding of all the goals, buy-in, and sense of ownership across the program, and you avoid the follow-the-money thinking that can lead to grants with unclear or unfillable mandates that do not truly fit your organization. So I'm going to close with just a few tips and tricks that might help you. Well, I guess I should say that the grant itself, it was a 2-year grant. We were able to get through 1,500 linear feet of records. We did so on time. We got all of the pieces that we wanted out of it in terms of not only the processing, but getting the procedures and so forth in place that we're still using and refining today. So in our view, it was a very successful grant. So just a few tips. Use the grant writing staff, the grant funder staff. They really do want to hear from you. They want success for you in your program. They wrote the guidance documents, so they know these programs. I'm going to focus on this commissioner piece for a second. A lot of these folks, you know, the commissioners are the ones who make the decisions, and they have things that they like and they don't like. And if you talk to the staff, they'll let you avoid some of the red flags and pitfalls that might irritate these commissioners, and you don't want to do that if you want funding from them. So, and also they can help just run through and catch inconsistencies, and those inconsistencies can be the pieces that keep you from getting funding. I also like this image. You know, it's branding, and you don't want to be branded as not being a good grant writer. So here's a couple things to think about. Don't irritate the reviewer. Do things. You have to remember they're going through a lot of these applications and so forth. So they really want things. They want people to follow directions. They want to make sure that everything is in a clear, clean style. Your pages are that you adhere to the rules. You provide examples, and you're passionate about what you do without overselling yourself, because they can tell that pretty quickly too. One way you can get into the head of the reviewers is to become a review grantor, or to review grants yourself. You can do that on the local level through your SHRAB or a lot of different historic institutions in your area. It gives you a better idea of how they and why they make decisions. And it can take the sting out of rejection a little bit if you understand all the variables that go into these decision-making, and you understand that, yes, they do want you to apply again, and that you probably should. And the red flags that can, again, irritate them. Remember that each element within a grant has a function, and it might not be what you think at first blush. The executive summary, this is a place where you're going to give the first impression. Make it a good one. A lot of times these folks aren't going to, you know, there's going to be people who are doing the reviewing that aren't going to read anything but the summary. So this might be it, and this is your chance. And I have that saying there, read first, written last, read first, written last. This is probably going to be the first thing that's read, especially if someone reads the entire document, but it should be the thing that you write last, so that you have all of the changes in and you have that consistency from front to back of your document. Introductory statements, this is where you're setting your credibility. So make sure that you do put in those pieces of, you know, this is what we've accomplished in the past, this is what we want to accomplish in the future, and you are the perfect funder to help us do that. Statement of need, it's not only an evidence, this is not only the place where you provide evidence of what you need, but also it's your chance to show your knowledge of best practices, and again, what you've already done. I think everybody's seen this simple piece. Specific, immediate, meaning timely, measurable, practical, logical, valuable. You know, all those things. If you look at the writing, the pieces that are put forward by these granting institutions, all of those elements are there. Please do all of these things is what they're telling you. All right, and the last piece is if you're not funded, remember that you're building a relationship with someone. Every one of us who've ever received a grant probably have asked for money from this institution before. You usually don't get it the first time. You have to go back. So be sure that you respond to that rejection letter. Thank them for the opportunity. Ask them how you can improve, and let them know that you're not giving up. I think these are really important pieces. Okay, and this is my contact information. I'd be glad to talk to anyone further about this. And I guess with that, I'll send this off to Errol.
Thank you. Thank you, Jodie. I'm happy to be third in a way, but I used to complain about being the middle child, but I think being third may be worse because you all have provided a lot of what I would like to say, although I'll try to give a different approach as it really kind of focuses on the NEH experience. Can I And there is my first slide. Thank you for this opportunity, by the way. I want to say that I have worked in the archives area for a while, but as you will see, I really am, as director of the Virginia Newspaper Project, I'm really in the library side of the Library of Virginia. So, but this is one of the ideas that I want to push forward in this brief presentation, is the idea that we are not silos, and I will get to that in a minute. I just thought this was a beautiful map, and I wanted to include it because it has Virginia with the future, of course, West Virginia on there, and we have done completed projects that involve partnerships with West Virginia. So I hope to get to that as well. So I guess my talk really is about better living through NEH grants, and there's my some immediate contact information. There's something at the end, so if you want to email me or talk to me about my experiences, feel free. I will say that I am not writing or reading from a prepared script. I had some notes, and I wanted to be able to adjust my talk a little bit on the fly based on what we've heard already, so that I don't bore you with too much repetition, although I think it's not going to be, I think it's going to be unavoidable to some extent. I have written many NEH grants, I will say, or I've either contributed or written myself many NEH grants. NEH does stand for the National Endowment for the Humanities. Don't want to use too many acronyms. And I've been involved with NEH really actually going back to the New York Public Library, so I have a pretty keen understanding of how they work. And the great thing about them, as I get to my next slide, is well, first let me tell you a little about the Library of Virginia. And that is, the Library of Virginia is a state agency, and it is the state archives and library of Virginia. So we're all here in one location. We have no formal, as others or as Jodie mentioned, we do not have a formal in-house grant writer. One was recently assigned, so there may be some pressure taken off us in that way, but that remains to be seen. But I do want to mention this because I think one of the things that's come up with the Massachusetts experience and Montana is the size of the institution and the size also of the infrastructure and how that works for you, your participants, and whether it's a plus or a minus or how you're going to find your way. I think one of the real challenges of presentations like this is every institution is different. One of the reasons why I wanted to mention that I worked at the New York Public Library and Columbia University Library prior to here is just show the various or the varied places that I've worked. So I've seen different infrastructures, different cultures, as many of you have as well. And you have to adapt to the needs or the exigencies of that particular institution. A couple of examples of projects going on at the Library of Virginia. One of them, of course, is the National Digital Newspaper Program, of which I direct, both for the state of Virginia and a cooperative project with West Virginia. So Michael has talked a little about partnerships, and that was certainly a very successful partnership with West Virginia University. We're very excited about that. The other project is called Virginia Untold, which I guess, if you wanted to use shorthand, you would call it a slave name index. We are going through many of our archives and pulling out the names of enslaved people and of African Americans enslaved here in Virginia. And we're going through many, many different types of archival records. Now, why am I mentioning this? Well, one of the reasons I'm mentioning this is moving forward, when we write a grant, I may mention how my project benefits this program or this project, which may also be, perhaps coincidentally, an NEH project or a project funded by NHPRC or IMLS or even the National Science Foundation. So siloing is a real problem sometimes in the library archives world, and we want to avoid that because these partnerships cannot not only happen outside your institution with another institution, it could actually happen right within the walls of your own institution. So that's just a quick snapshot of the Library of Virginia where I work. Okay, if this was my story in one slide, my focus will be on the National Endowment for the Humanities, although I do believe the comments I'm making are applicable to many other granting institutions. I've certainly seen that when I start looking at the guidelines or specifications guidelines or how to fill out a grant in other agencies, not only a federal or state or even private. You see some obvious similarities, and I'm sure you all are aware of that. There is a situation here at the Library of Virginia where we generally are preparing the grants on our own. So we are, as Lily Tomlin once said, we're all in this alone. So this is my situation here at the Library of Virginia, and that's got its advantages and disadvantages. And I'd like to just talk about that very briefly, which is the advantage, of course, is well, I'll get to that. The point is that when you're doing most of the work, obviously, you're, as even Michael, I think, you're in control, and there's certain advantages to that. And you can have a singular voice, you get to write it, you get to do your own research. The problem is, do you have the time? So you have to find out if you're able to even pull this off, given the amount of work that you already have piled on your desk. This is something that others have mentioned, but I'm sorry, I'm going to have to repeat it, which is working with your administrators and program officers. With administrators, it's the nasty sort of bureaucratic stuff that you want to get to, which is, as Jodie mentioned, DUNS numbers, understanding indirect costs and cost share, and this is the nuts and bolts of making a grant work. I think we talk a lot about indirect costs, which is real interesting because it varies greatly from institution to institution. So that's something you want to know immediately. I think in institutions of higher learning, it tends to be a little higher maybe than in a state agency, but I could be wrong, but that seems to be a little bit of my understanding. The current climate. Well, and also working with your program officers, as Jodie mentioned, they are there for you, and it's really surprising, I think, that I've noticed how reluctant people are to call the program officers. They are eager to help, they know what they're doing, and they also can steer you toward and away from certain ideas or concepts. And they can also just give you one or two words that could change everything. And hopefully, I think I might have an example of that. The current climate. Well, tell you what, we are in a 24-minute news cycle because I just learned not a couple of hours ago that the director of the National Endowment for the Humanities, the director of NEH, William Adams, Bro Adams, has just resigned. He resigned, and his leaving the office is effective immediately. Now, there's probably a backstory there, I don't know, but that does send you into a world of wondering what's going on, and there's this feeling of uncertainty with a number of agencies such as IMLS and NEH and NEA, and this just adds to that level of uncertainty and that the ground is not firm under our feet. So what do we do when that's the situation? But moving on, let's say you apply and you get the grant, now what? So these are things I'd love to like to cover. As I said, you're in control of the process. Let me just add that this allows you to call the program officer a lot and really get on their nerves and find out a lot about the demands of your particular project. NEH is very clear, and I'm sorry, I'm going to probably repeat myself, but the NEH is very clear on the main page on the guidelines for applying. But I'm going to tell you, I think it's equally important that you add your own voice, that you show them something that you think they haven't seen before. And with my case, and I will say that hubris is a sin, but for these few short minutes, I have to, I guess, brag in the sense that when I was looking at the National Endowment for the Humanities and the National Digital Newspaper Program, I had to see how Virginia would have a special case. Well, obviously it's a special case because it's one of the original 13 colonies. But also what I thought is that we have really old newspapers. If we're in there with an applicant pool of other states, maybe even Western states, we have antebellum newspapers that could add to their corpus. So there was that we wanted to look at. So I always tried to add something that gave us a little more diesel to our application. Within your institution, of course, you want to find, your advocates. I wanted to say, Jodie, I think later on we'll have a nice discussion about writing grants by committee, because I just find that very difficult. So, but I think Jodie just proved me wrong, and but more on that another time when we can talk about it. But once again, find your advocates within your institution and contact granting agencies, officers, and they are, as I said, they're keys to your success. So I apologize for the repetition, but I think within your institution, you're going to want to find the person that you can, I hate to use, well, I need to use this word, is sell the project and let it grow from there. Here's a tip that I want to throw out immediately, because some agencies or certain projects, certain granting agency require an advisory board. And all too often the advisory board becomes the controlling body. And since you're the grant writer, make sure that you are controlling the advisory board. And I've seen situations where the intellectual issues that the advisory board started getting involved in overpowered, almost overpowered the grant writer and the recipient of the grant. So that's just a tip that I wanted to throw out immediately, because often with NEH grants there is there sometimes or often is an advisory board. The budget forms they offer online are really like from 1999. I don't understand. They're not as they should be a little more high tech, but they just they need I think you can do better on your own. Take an Excel spreadsheet and jazz it up, and you'll see that that it'll work better for you. And I think it'll look better. It'll look prettier, to be honest with you. Deadlines, depending on your infrastructure, you have to decide whether you have time to write the grant and submit the grant. I actually personally submit the grant, but some agencies, you may send it to some sort of sponsored programs, Department of Sponsored Programs, and things like that. So make sure that you have time for review by administrators, or that they're even going to submit it, and make sure they actually do submit it. Think both big and small. And by this, I mean, if you have a large project, you might be better served with a challenge grant or a proof of concept. Program officer will talk to you about that. And that is such a cool option now, is getting a smaller grant to show that you can do this thing. So think about that. Granting agencies, I think, as Michael mentioned, love partnerships, whether regional or conceptual. We're looking at something like that now with the slave name index. And I did a partnership with West Virginia, and that really worked out very well because West Virginia didn't have the infrastructure to do a lot of digital conversion. So it was a win-win. The neat thing, Jodie was talking about some good critical responses. One thing is some granting agencies will provide the critical comments or review notes if you don't get a grant. So you can see almost firsthand where you might have gone wrong or where you just missed the mark. If your conditions are right, you can paper the room. And by that I mean write a grant that can be submitted to more than one agency. I've seen it done, and it actually can work with some modification. My tip, it's an applicant's market. I'm saying my experience has been if there's an agency that seems to have funding issues like NEH, I almost guarantee that applications are down. I don't know this. I don't have any inside knowledge, but it just seems like a real possibility based on my experience at the state level. Is there a creative approach? That's what I was talking about looking at your grant idea, but seeing some angle or inefficiency in the system where you think you can add something special. Appreciate benchmarks. Create a timeline. Use software that works for you. But accept that things go wrong, y'all. You will not go to archives jail if you fall behind. Believe me, adjust and move on. You have to understand your relationship with your vendors. This is very important because they're going to be often, or service bureau, they're often going to be the reason you're on time or late. It's not always going to be on you. I've already mentioned program officers. You know, you've heard it before, work with them. Repeat, if there's an advisory board. It's just something I've seen happen in the past, and I just want to, not to me, but to others, so just a warning. You're allowed to ask stupid questions. I really did, and I really benefited from embarrassing myself. And that's my contact information. If you have any questions, you can contact me. I wanted to add that one of the one of the projects that I was talking about was that I've been involved with is one that involves, once again, slave names. And I think we've seen the opportunity to work with NHPRC, NEH, and other grant offering, and all we had to do really was modify the grant so that it could work for all, for the various granted agencies. I think that's, I don't want to overrun my time, and I appreciate the time to talk, but I think one last thing I want to say is what just happened today in the last few hours is really rather telling, but you have to assume that everything's going to be okay and move on, because that could create an opportunity for you if others decide not to apply for a grant. So, thank you.
Thank you. Thank you to Michael, Jodie, and Errol for your insights and advice about grants planning and management. Lots of good things to think about and hopefully talk about. So it's now time for your questions and comments, and you can choose to put them in the chat box or in the Q&A box. We'll be watching both of those windows. But as those are coming in, I'd like to say to Jodie that I'm really impressed with how you've used your strategic plan to inform your funding strategies. And so I'd like to ask Michael and Errol if your organization's approach to grant funding is done in a similar way, i.e. through its strategic plan. Could either one of you talk to that, or both of you talk to that point?
Mm-hmm.
I can, but I'll let Michael go first if he wants.
Sure. I mean, yeah, to a large extent, that's the way we do it. And one of the sort of the thoughts about strategic planning that we have here is, and many years back, we sort of came out with the sort of the, pretty much the stereotypical, 5-year plans, looking at that. Then we really did a turnabout where we were trying to come up with strategic planning that gave us more direction in the way of achievable goals and, and sort of measurable results. So to the extent that we only plan out to a certain extent, yes. I mean, we look at, as I mentioned in my presentation, trying to identify critical needs and using that as a guideline, and then trying to match up appropriate funding resources. But again, it's sort of like a standalone piece that we haven't really engaged in without the benefit of partners in some time. I mean, we just kind of look, when we're choosing partners and we're trying to select who might have an opportunity for us to align ourselves to, the strategic plan does, to that extent, sort of drive the mission. But again, our planning is more narrowly focused. We're kind of only a couple of years out, and try to have a general checklist that we know that we can achieve, so we don't get too sort of overwhelmed by the process itself.
And Michael, does your plan also then identify potential partners as well?
Yes, and if you know, one of the things we've actually established a few. That's one of the joys of doing this sort of collaborative approach, that you do find willing partners that you can sort of link up with more than one. So, I mean, one of the frequent partners that we've used, they have a wonderful sort of administrative apparatus to take advantage of, and that's the Massachusetts Board of Library Commissioners. So a lot of our efforts have happened with them as a significant partner. Some of them they've actually introduced and approached us with, and others that we've sort of approached them with. In addition to other collaboratives that we're part of, where, as I mentioned, with disaster preparedness and emergency planning, we're a member of a fairly expansive cultural collaborative here in Massachusetts. And collectively, we've all sort of, worked together on things as they are identified. So, yeah, I mean, as we go through one process, you find particular partners that really sort of match up well with you and have sort of similar interests and ideals and goals, and you kind of go back to the well more than once.
Right, right. How about the Library of Virginia, Errol?
Well, I'm going to take a slightly different approach and talk about somebody else's 5-year plan, which is, say, LSTA. The LSTA 5-year strategic plan came out, and now they're revising it. And so what you're doing now is you're looking at what they want and saying, well, wait a minute, we can meet the needs of section, A or B quite nicely because of a certain project. So once again, let me use the newspaper project as an example. We may look at LSTA and say, well, there's a nice partnership here because public libraries really like to have more newspapers online or even digitized or microfilmed or whatever. And because they're quantifiable, they can even measure results or levels of satisfaction or use through database. access or viewership or number of searches, we will actually look at that. So we'll look at somebody else's strategic plan or 5-year plan and say, well, how can we marry into that? And that has worked for us. So I just want to use that as sort of a different approach as opposed to the institutional strategic plan, which I would not be as interesting, I think, for me to talk about. But I just like the idea of trying to meet a scene where two organizations can come together because we're meeting the needs of their strategic or 5-year plan. I may want to add here, just as an aside, that when we're doing that, we're also saying what we've done good up till then. When I write a grant, I want to take out some of the boilerplate and say, look at what we've done so far. These are some of our successes, and now we're coming to you as another springboard to bigger and better things. So, and I think that's how we approached some of these granting agencies, including, LSTA or NEH or NHPRC.
Right, right. Jodie, I'd like to bring you into this conversation about the collaborative approach. And is that, would you say, is that an institutional philosophy for the Montana Historical Society in terms of any project, but particularly when you're looking at grant funding?
Yeah, we, especially within the research center, that's really how leadership has pushed us to a certain extent, because, like most archives, we're full of introverts, but we, that is the way that we've approached a lot of our projects, and we do, within the archives itself, do a fair amount of joint processing as team building, as a way to make sure that we're doing things consistently and so forth. So it is what our director wants us to do, and I think it fits with the overall culture here very well. But I do recognize that that's not always the case in terms of working as a group, especially on grant writing. But, really the different programs are just working on a portion, and the portions come together under leadership. It is kind of what the point I was making as well.
I'm not seeing any questions coming in, so you three have done a fabulous job covering everyone's questions. I have one last question, and this is for all three of you, and that is, how do you measure the impact of grant-funded projects on internal capacity of your organization, not only to complete the project and do it successfully, but sort of the next step, does it grow the capacity also? Does that make sense?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Can you speak to that?
Sure, I can start. I think, especially with this NHPRC grant, that was part of our goal, was to get tools out of the grant at the end of it for us to be able to move forward and be more efficient and integrate MPLP. And I think that's one of the ways that you can really impress funders, is by saying that you've thought about those things, that there is a life beyond whatever the immediate project is. And as the other two folks have mentioned, you are trying to show off what you've done, where you want to go, and how this particular grant will tie into that overall planning and view of the work that you do. So you're not doing anything in a silo. You're going to move forward. Does that mean that you're not going to be whelmed at times while you're doing these grants? Of course, but you have to think of that within your overall planning, that's going to happen, and you're going to have to deal with that, and you're going to stumble, but it's okay.
Yeah, no, that's an interesting point, Jodie. I would add, when you talk about working with other people, and is looking at sustainability. That's always a big part of what we're trying to achieve. Anything we engage in, we'd like to think that we're going to be able to keep the benefit extended beyond the end of the grant cycle, and that can be a challenge unto itself. But one of the challenges we had, sort of again looking back to the collaborative approach, is that clearly by working with particular partners, we're able to get greater visibility for our collections. That's that's a goal for us at all times. And I alluded to our partnership with the Harvard and Yale University materials. And that was great. It said they have the marketing, the infrastructure to really push it in a way beyond, I think, what we might normally be able to do on our own. The only problem is you can sometimes get consumed by that. In other words, there are collections. We want to make sure that the identity of our collections are always, a part of the final product. So it's, while you're working with other partners, you don't want to be overshadowed by them and have the misconception that many of your materials are actually accessible to other institutions, and you're not sort of forwarding the objective that you've kind of put forth there when you agreed to the whole thing. So.
So let me just jump in and say that if I'm turning to NEH just to run a project, when the project's over, that's it, then I don't know if the library is game. So we've talked a lot about sustainability. And I think what happened with the news, you asked about the impact, and with, a large percentage of the Library of Virginia patrons are it's really about genealogy. Yeah. So now we've contributed 400, almost 500,000, hundreds of thousands of pages to the NDNP, the National Digital Newspaper Program, to the Library of Congress. But what we did is, because we had such a large body of work, and we had what I would call out-of-scope titles that we could digitize, we created our own database here at the Library of Virginia. That database now gets hundreds of searches a day. So now it's become one of our most visible databases, and so that is add visibility to the library. It has a transcribe or text correcting feature, which adds a new cohort of people, of patrons. And so I think it's really helped add visibility and enhance the library's collections in many ways. But we would not have done this without NEH or granting agencies. But I think this agency also understands now they have a responsibility. Let's see what we can do to try to sustain this. Yeah. So sorry to run on, but I just wanted to make that point.
No, that's great. Barbara, I understand you have a question?
Well, I just wondered, we'd heard about good practices and best practices from our three speakers with their really good presentations. I just wonder if you have any warning for like particular mistakes or sort of bad practices.
Well, again, keeping the theme alive here of a collaborative approach, I think Jodie touched upon it, and Errol made mention of it as well. When you are sort of doing the the team effort, the group thing, you have to. It's difficult for that you can go off topic really quickly when you have a lot of different writing styles and sort of opinions and perspectives coming into the final product, and it can make it somewhat disjointed. Jodie talked about it a little bit, and I find that to be one of the particular challenges that we've encountered, because we have great partners, but everybody has sort of different viewpoints, and if you don't have a singular voice sort of really editing the final piece and getting it in some sort of uniform structure, it's a problem. So you can go into bad practice quickly by presenting something that is a bit confusing and doesn't have really sort of a cohesive sense.
In our case, I think we were one of the first awardees for a number of projects, and there was a situation where I almost didn't even know how to ask a question. So it was like, how do I even ask a stupid question? And so that got me caught in a situation where I think we kind of floundered a little bit early on, just trying to get our feet under us. But that was one of the real challenges, was just going into something that was so new that we struggled a little bit. But it's a learning experience, and it was well worth it, and it was one of the more gratifying things that I've done. So.
I would say probably, well, there's a lot of different things, but one of the biggest lessons that we learned, I think, is really just don't give up. In the past, when we had a little bit more of a ad hoc approach, we would just be crushed because this was such a great grant, and my gosh, why didn't they fund it? But the reality is you can take that grant and you can mold it into something else that can work. And, don't ever leave behind anything that it has potential. Just make sure that you're following it that you're taking to heart what's being said to you, and that it's not a personal thing, but you can learn from it and you can move on and you can get a successful grant. You just don't give up.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I'd agree. The person who don't succeed, just keep trying. We just recently heard this week of an effort that we started, some while ago, and again, it's through FEMA, a fairly large grant that, we had tried a couple of iterations and it didn't gel, and we just kept, pushing it, and we thought it was kind of off the boards now, and they just moved on. But we got notification this week that it's still viable and it's looking good for us. So, yeah, don't quit. Don't take it personally, as Jodie said. And if it's a good effort, if it's a good program, if it's for a good objective, just keep plugging at it.
And as Lizette from Connecticut notes, a lot of grantees overthink the questions that are being asked of them in grant applications, so that's something to also keep in mind too.
Great point.
And maybe, we tend to get so wrapped up in things that we want to tell them everything, and, that you need to kind of be measured and moderate too. Thank you for all this good information. We really appreciate you, Michael, Jodie, and Errol being with us today. And I'm going to turn the microphone over to Barbara to talk about upcoming webinars and events and to close out today's webinar. Barbara?
Hi, everyone, and I will try not to keep you very long because I know we're a little bit over time, but just a reminder, you will be able to hear from Michael a little bit more next week. If you have some questions to follow up from today or some questions about writing or managing grants, Michael's going to be available on a phone call. It's not a webinar. You don't have to pre-register. Just call in this time now, 3 o'clock Eastern next week, to this number. Use the conference code and then just ask questions. We'll be there to have some discussions, sort of like we've just had at the end of the webinar, so please be sure to join us. This is a new feature that CoSA is trying, so Michael, you'll be hosting the second Learning Lab conference call ever for CoSA, so we hope that all of you who are on the phone call today will join us. We also have some other webinars coming up. Our grant webinars will continue for the next couple of months with a break for a few things. Next month in June, we have Sarah Kuntz and Steve Excel are going to talk about sustaining a grant-funded program once the funding has expired. And then Steve will be available the week after for a Learning Lab conference call then as well. We're going to have an annual meeting wrap-up webinar like we do every year, just to talk about things that happened at the annual meeting, whether you were able to come to the meeting or whether you weren't. It's probably a good time to go ahead and attend this so that you know what happened and what you might have missed. Even if you were at the meeting, you can't absorb everything, so it's good to come to the annual meeting wrap-up. And then we'll return to grants again in August, and we'll have more information coming up on that in the next couple of months. We have one more webinar left in CoSA's Preservica Practical Digital Preservation webinar series. It's going to be June 13th, and notice it's not at the regular 2 o'clock Eastern for the CoSA Preservica webinar. It's actually at 11 a.m. because we have some speakers from Europe. So that is, I don't know, 4 o'clock their time or 5 o'clock, I'm not really sure. So that's like the latest that they could do it in their day. So just make a note that that is going to happen a little bit earlier than it usually does. And thanks as always to CoSA's corporate sponsors, Ancestry, Family Search, Preservica, APPX Software, Gaylord Archival, and Space Saver, and to our federal funders, the NHPRC and the IMLS. Currently, CoSA does not have a federal grant. Our last grant ended on March 31st, but we're actually applying for a couple of more grants at this time. They're due later or in the middle of next month, so we hope to have more federal funding, but many of the things that we're still doing are based on the grants that we had from NHPRC and IMLS. And we have upcoming events. Of course, everyone wants to know what's going on with the CoSA annual meeting in Boise on July 12th. We're going to be sending out, it'll be in the CoSA newsletter next week, and also you'll get an email, so you'll have all the details about the annual meeting. Our annual meeting all takes place on one day, and it's followed by the Nagara Conference, also in Boise. And then there's some other conferences coming up in the next several months, the SAA conference as well as the NDSA and BPE conferences. And please, for everyone who's still here and hasn't hung up yet, please do your evaluation. We really would appreciate it. We haven't been getting as many evaluations as we would like, and we would like to have some feedback and know what you think about our presentation today. I know I got a lot of information from it, so I hope if you feel that way too, or if you have suggestions for improvement, please let us know and fill out the evaluation. And thank you again for attending today. We appreciate it so much. We're happy to have you here with us, and we want to know if there's anything if you want to get in touch with us, please use the website, the portal, Twitter, Facebook, or email us if you have any questions. And thanks again for our presenters today. We really appreciate Michael, Jodie, and Errol for being here, and thanks to you all for joining us. Have a good afternoon. Thank you. Bye-bye.
Thank you, everyone.
Thanks, guys.